If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in this inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and angry dogs, making their mock of our accursed lot. Like men we will face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. Claude McKay wrote the poem If We Must Die after a series of attacks against black Americans in the United States in the summer of 1919. Author James Weldon Johnson coined the term Red Summer to describe those events. A century ago, hundreds of black Americans were killed in attacks all across the country, and yet the nation has built few memorials to those dead. The Red Summer of 1919 deserves to be remembered. 1919 was somewhat of a turning point for the United States. The First World War ended in November 1918. Veterans returned to America that was rapidly changing. Women would soon gain the right to vote, and Prohibition would begin an experiment in banning alcohol. The Army during the First World War was segregated, and some black regiments were put under French command because white American officers were not comfortable commanding black troops. Many white Americans blamed the coming tragedy on the French for treating black soldiers as equals and planting ideas in their heads. Called soldiers of democracy, black veterans came back to the United States ready to demand civil rights. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, we return from fighting, we return fighting." For black Americans, 1919 marked 300 years since the first African slaves were brought to the American colonies, and they had begun to start calling for change. 1919 was a time of anxiety in the United States and the world. The First World War had ended, but other social movements and economic conditions contributed to an anxious time. Inflation was rising. Labor strikes were common. In Russia, the Bolsheviks had overthrown the Tsar. Americans feared Bolshevik agitation might come to their shores. Anarchist bombings were common. The economy was in flux, and in northern cities, white residents were afraid of the new black migrants, bringing economic competition. The Great Migration would eventually send millions of black Americans to the industrial North and Midwest, fleeing violence, segregation, and lack of economic opportunity in the South. Unfortunately, they were sometimes greeted with the same in places where they relocated. While they were at first unconcerned, Southern employers eventually worried about the loss of cheap labor, or to stem the tide of the exodus. From spring into fall of 1919, these tensions exploded into a series of violent episodes that killed hundreds of black Americans. Served as a wake-up call, but it also spurred a movement in which blacks in America fought back, sometimes for the first time. An early episode of violence occurred in Jenkins County, Georgia, in April. A black church party was interrupted when two white officers arrested a black man named Edmund Scott for possession of a pistol. A wealthy black farmer named Joe Ruffin offered to pay his fine, but the officers demanded cash instead of a check. When Ruffin tried to pull Scott to the car, an officer struck Ruffin with his pistol, which discharged, knocking Ruffin unconscious. Ruffin's son, an Army veteran, thinking his father was dead, shot and killed one of the officers in retaliation. In the ensuing gunfight, the second officer was wounded and then beaten to death. As news spread, what was described as hundreds of white men rushed into the town, bent on revenge. Joe surrendered to the local sheriff, who protected him from a mob bent on lynching. But the mob caught and lynched two of his sons, as well as another black man who had been in the area. They also burned the church and 6 other black churches, as well as 3 black Masonic lodges in the area. Ruffin was led to another county by the sheriff and put in jail there. Repeated attempts to try him for murder or manslaughter finally failed, but he was left impoverished from his legal expenses, moved to South Carolina, as it would not have been safe in Georgia. No charges were ever filed against any of the men who killed Ruffin's sons or destroyed property. On July 19th, in Washington, D.C., a white woman was jostled on the street by 2 black men. One of the men was questioned by police and released, but a rumor started among some white Army veterans that the man had committed rape. A white mob started a 4-day riot, attacking and beating hundreds of black individuals and damaging businesses. When the city's police refused to intervene, black Americans fought back and defended their neighborhoods with firearms. There were shootings and attacks from both sides, as President Woodrow Wilson finally sent 200 Army troops to intervene, although heavy summer rains may have done more to quell the riot than the troops. When it finally ended, July 25th, as many as 40 people had died from gunshot wounds or in street fights. At least 150 were injured. In Chicago, Illinois, a week-long riot was set off on July 27th when a black teenager named Eugene Williams hanging onto a makeshift raft, unknowingly floated into the white part of an unofficially segregated Southside beach on Lake Michigan. A white man threw rocks at Williams and other black swimmers to drive them away. Williams was hit in the forehead, knocking him into the water, where he drowned. When black witnesses tried to get the man who threw the rock arrested, the police did nothing, and when the bystanders complained, a fight broke out between white and black mobs, and spread into 5 days of general rioting. While there was violence on both sides, the vast majority of the acts of murder, arson, and property damage were perpetrated by white gangs against black residents on Chicago's South Side. Police did little to protect the black neighborhoods, and the state's attorney accused the police of arresting African-American rioters while refusing to arrest white rioters. Illinois was forced to call in the militia to restore order. 23 black and 15 white residents were killed in the rioting. 500 more were injured. More than 1,000 black families were left homeless due to arson. The black men who fought back in D.C. and Chicago were often returning veterans of the First World War. They had military training, were ready to defend themselves and their families. It marked a difference from riots of previous years when blacks were attacked and mostly could not or did not defend themselves. The violence made one veteran, Harry Haywood, say he realized, "I had been fighting the wrong war. The Germans weren't the enemy. The enemy was right here at home." Economic tensions also impacted events at a riot in Omaha, Nebraska at the end of September. 2 years previous to the riot, a local meatpacking plant had brought in black workers as strikebreakers, and that had caused tension between them and white working-class people of the town. When a black man was accused of raping a white woman, a mob of as many as 10,000 descended on the courthouse, demanding the police turn over the man. The mob set fire to the courthouse and captured and tried to hang the mayor. They also destroyed private property, attacking black neighborhoods and stores. Eventually, the police, surrounded in the burning building, had no choice but to hand the man, named Will Brown, to the mob, who lynched him and burned his body. A young Henry Fonda witnessed the lynching and said it had a profound effect on him. Federal troops finally quelled the riot. 120 people were arrested for their involvement, but most were never successfully prosecuted, and all were eventually released without serving prison sentences. The deadliest episode in the Red Summer started September 30th in Elaine, Arkansas. A union of black sharecroppers was meeting with farmers to discuss how to obtain fairer settlements from white landowners, who they argued had been exploiting the farmers. The planters did not want to pay higher wages, and rumors insinuated that communists were behind the unrest, reflecting larger tensions in the United States as many Americans feared the Russian Revolution was coming to their shores. When 2 armed white deputies showed up at the meeting, they clashed with armed Union guards. It's never been determined who shot first, but a white deputy was killed. The local sheriff called for a posse to arrest those responsible for the killing. Spurred by rumors and sensational headlines about a planned insurrection, a mob of over 1,000 white men descended on the county, indiscriminately killing black men, women, and children. Estimates vary, but between 100 to more than 500 black people were murdered by the mob. The governor called in federal troops who disarmed both sides, but arrested and held 285 black residents. The governor established a committee of prominent white residents who, without interviewing any of the sharecroppers, concluded that the riot was caused by socialist agitators. Despite the widespread murders of black residents, an all-white grand jury indicted no white people and instead indicted 122 black men in connection with the riot. Arkansas had used poll taxes to disenfranchise most black voters, thus removing them from the jury pool, and the black men were tried by all-white juries, often accused with evidence from witnesses who were coerced, in trials where armed white mobs were outside and sometimes even inside the courtroom. 12 men, called the Arkansas 12, were convicted of murder, sentenced to death. Eventually, the U.S. Supreme Court vacated 6 of those convictions on the grounds that the mob atmosphere and coerced testimony denied the men due process. The other 6 were given indefinite furloughs by outgoing Governor Thomas McCrae and taken out of state to prevent their execution. Most modern researchers discount the assertion that there was a planned insurrection or any plan to target white planters for murder, but a conference held in 2000 to review the facts of the event found that the claim appears to be still widely believed. While these represent a few of the more violent events of the Red Summer, they are just a few of the more than 25 riots, massacres, and lynchings that occurred across the United States in the late spring into the fall of 1919. In the aftermath of the Red Summer, Dr. George Haynes, a sociologist employed by the Wilson administration, published a report in the New York Times and other newspapers. It was a call to action about the epidemic of lynchings. The report concluded that from 1889 to 1918, more than 3,000 black people had been lynched in the United States. The report highlighted that states rarely prosecuted the perpetrators of the lynchings and showed little motivation to address the problem of lynchings. He warned that unchecked mob violence creates hatred and intolerance, making impossible free and dispassionate discussion not only of race problems, but questions on which races and sections differ. In such a state of mind, Dr. Haynes wrote, a trivial incident can precipitate a riot. Haynes' report largely fell on deaf ears. The government and news media largely attempted to frame black resistance to the violence of the Red Summer as derived from socialist agitators. The government provided evidence to the media to support his assertion that political organizations were urging blacks to embrace communism. They said that unions were spreading propaganda to breed racial hatred and accused W.E.B. Du Bois of editorializing about socialism. Others, including future FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, blamed black radicals while ignoring white perpetrators of violence. Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender told a different story. Journalists like Ida B. Wells investigated the attacks and got the story out that blacks were sometimes justified in fighting. There was some progress. The Supreme Court decision in Moore v. Dempsey, which effectively freed the Arkansas 12, represented a significant shift in policy towards a wider use of federal writs of habeas corpus to oversee state court convictions and represented stricter scrutiny by the Supreme Court of state criminal trials in terms of their compliance with the Bill of Rights. But the largest effect of the violence of the Red Summer was on the black community. Throughout the Red Summer, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had been contacting government officials to raise the alarm, but they were mostly met with indifference, sometimes outright hostility. The NAACP had been formed after the 1908 Springfield, Illinois race riot. In those days, it was led by prominent white supporters of black civil rights. After the Red Summer, black Americans emerged as the leaders of the NAACP and began directing the legal and political advocacy that would lead to success in the civil rights movement in the mid-20th century. By the early 1920s, membership had increased to 100,000 from just 9,000 before the First World War. 100 years later, the nation is still trying to come to grips with the events of the Red Summer. The violence is largely forgotten, even in communities where it occurred. People have been afraid to bring it up for fear that it would raise new tensions, or maybe just because they didn't want to face the past. Chicago is hosting a number of historical events this summer to help the city remember this nearly forgotten chapter in its history. And for the first time, 100 years later, a memorial is being built to the victims of the Elaine, Arkansas massacre, though not in Elaine, in nearby West Helena. In April, a willow tree was planted in Elaine to memorialize those victims. And in August, in the night, someone came and chopped it down, a sign that not everybody wants to remember the past. There are very few historical markers to the violence of the Red Summer in the United States. To most Americans, it is just forgotten history, even though it was the beginning of an awakening. Incorporated in 1837, the city of Chicago had a booming economy and experienced massive growth in the run-up to the turn of the 20th century. In 1840, Chicago was the 92nd most populous city in the United States. By 1870, it was the second most populous city in the United States. And by 1900, it was the fifth most populous city in the world, behind only London, New York, Paris, and Berlin. Between 1890 and 1900, the population of Chicago doubled. And between 1900 and 1920, it doubled again. An industrial center, it attracted not just mass immigration from Europe, but also from African Americans from the Deep South and what was called the Great Migration. The population of African Americans in Chicago in 1910 was around 44,000. By 1930, that population was around 234,000. And that spurred an explosion in African American art and literature and music that was called the Chicago Black Renaissance, but also drove racial tensions that resulted in the terrible 1919 Chicago race riots in which 38 people were killed. And then the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1919 brought the nation into the era of Prohibition, and Chicago became notorious worldwide as a center of gangland violence as rival gangs competed over the control of liquor imported from Canada in the bootlegging wars and the gangster era. The murder rate in Chicago increased 250% between 1923 and 1928. And it is therefore not surprising in this huge, growing, sprawling city that was roiling with tensions that the sort of typical conflict that cab drivers might have over places to pick up fares was taken to unbelievable heights. The Chicago Taxicab Wars of the 1920s deserve to be remembered. John Daniel Hertz was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1879, and his family immigrated to Chicago when he was 5 years old. He was a successful prize fighter in his youth and then managed prize fighters, but by 1904 he was selling cars, a job at which he excelled. In 1907 he became part owner of an automobile dealership with a friend named Walden Shaw when he struck upon a business idea. The dealership was making good sales, but much of their resources were tied up in the cars traded in. The used car market had not developed yet, and these represented a financial liability. He was later quoted as saying, "As my customers weren't buyers of second-hand cars, I had to put on my thinking cap to find some ways of disposing them or making them earn their keep." His idea was to use the surplus to get into the relatively new business of renting pay-as-you-go taxicabs. At the time, horse-drawn hansom cabs were still the norm, and there were few motor car taxicabs operating in Chicago. But Chicago, where numerous railroads had terminals, was a prime location for taxicabs, as there was considerable need for on-demand, point-to-point, chauffeur-driven transportation. Hertz's brainchild, the Walden W. Shaw Auto Livery Company, quickly developed into one of the top motor cab companies operating in Chicago. In 1910, rates were 30 cents for the first half mile and 10 cents for each quarter mile thereafter. The company was innovative in a number of ways. For example, paying drivers by commission rather than salary, and in 1912, hiring women drivers, as that was supposed to address problems associated with men driving cabs, including impertinence to customers, overcharging for their own benefit, recklessness and fast driving, and inattention to the company's business. And those were just some of Hertz's innovations. Another one, for example, was that he, at his own expense, installed traffic lights on Michigan Avenue between Randolph and 12th Street. The resulting improvement in the flow of traffic was so impressive that the city of Chicago decided to expand the system and to reimburse Hertz. But Hertz's real innovations came in 1913, after visiting Paris and learning about their successful taxicab service there. Parisian cabs were solid black, making them easy to recognize. Unlike the large touring cars that they were using in Chicago, they were small, purpose-built vehicles, allowing lower upfront costs and lower operating expense. And Parisian cab drivers were more polite than those in America, spurring Hertz to limit his hiring only to the finest grade drivers, who would be trained in courtesy and rewarded with higher wages, more respect from the company, and, unusual for the day, company-paid health care. The company started using purpose-built cabs built around a four-cylinder Continental engine, all painted yellow. Hertz claimed the color was based on a university study that he commissioned that determined that yellow was the easiest color to spot, although there had been hansom cabs painted yellow in other cities at least since 1798. The color not only made it easier for customers to identify taxis, but the visibility of the color reduced accidents. The company was reorganized as the Yellow Cab Company. Notably, the Yellow Cab Company operated on the European model. Previously, livery cabs had operated under contracts with clubs and businesses, paying a fee to those businesses. The Yellow Cab Company instead would pick people up on the street, foregoing those fees. The new model allowed them to offer better service for a lower price. The Yellow Cab Company found great success, not just dominating the Chicago taxicab market, but also selling their purpose-built cabs and licensing franchises in other cities. Unexpectedly, Hertz's innovation had set the stage for the Chicago Taxi Wars. Hertz was a hard businessman and was noted for using heavy-handed tactics to put pressure on competitors to go out of business or to sell out to him. By 1920, the Yellow Cab Company had a virtual monopoly in the city of Chicago. The Yellow Cab's biggest competition were the lime green and cream-colored taxis of the Checker Cab Company. Unlike Yellow Cab, the Checker Company was an association of independent cab owner and operators who used a single livery. Competition for fares was always rough and tumble, with cab drivers pushing hubcap to hubcap at prime locations. But Hertz had pulled political strings to get the city to pass a cab stand permit law, a deliberate attempt to shut out checker drivers. Reportedly, Yellow Cab drivers got permits quickly, but Checker Cab drivers always faced delays. Checker complained, and when a councilman investigated, bad words were exchanged between the two companies. Many of the Checker drivers had been former Yellow Cab drivers, and Hertz considered them bad seeds. Yellow Cab's lawyer called the Checker drivers an irresponsible bunch of hoodlums. But the bad blood between the two companies turned violent on July 27, 1920. It started when a fistfight erupted between cabbies of the two companies, jockeying for position on a prime spot in front of a theater on the Loop, the central downtown business district. By evening, the fight had turned into a running gun battle that the Associated Press described as a battle between fleets of taxicabs in which the vehicles were maneuvered according to the best strategy of tank warfare, with their drivers firing hundreds of shots at each other. At one location, a dozen cabs in close formation roared by the branch garage of the other company, with pistols of the occupants crackling like machine guns. The garage defenders replied with several volleys and sent a fleet of cabs in pursuit. Amazingly, there were no casualties. The goal seems to have been property damage and intimidation, but soon casualties started occurring. A driver was wounded in the foot by gunfire on August 5th, and 2 more on August 7th. By the end of August 1920, 10 employees from the 2 companies had been wounded in gun battles that erupted nearly every night. At one point, city council minutes referred to the situation as a war of terrorism on the streets of Chicago. In response, police stepped up their presence and the taxicab war simmered down. But it escalated again in June of the next year. On June 7, 1921, a car drove by a Loop taxi stand and men inside fired 25 shots. One struck a yellow cab driver named P.A. Skirvin above the heart, killing him. John Hertz told the Chicago Tribune, "It has only been comic opera warfare until tonight, but from now on it is going to be a fight to the finish." The murder of Skirvin had been the culmination of a violent day. A passenger in a checker cab was injured on June 9th when yellow cabs forced it into the curb. Fights erupted throughout the day. A checker cab rammed a yellow cab, starting a brawl in which several drivers were injured. A group of yellow cab drivers overturned a checker cab, starting a gunfight in which a driver was wounded. Later that evening, another driver was wounded when he was hit in the head with a brick. The murder of Skirvin, who was shooting the breeze with other drivers, was found to be in retaliation for the driver hit with a brick. The shooting itself was perpetrated by 3 mob enforcers, but the drivers of the cab carrying them were identified and, in 1925, were convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Their families still insist that they were fall guys for the mob, and their sentences were commuted by Illinois Governor Len Small in 1928. Again, the city council intervened, having the police search all cabs for weapons and threatening to pull both companies' operating licenses. But violence erupted again in 1923, as men in a checker cab fired shots at a yellow cab superintendent, and then fired at the police pursuing them. In the midst of it all were charges of political and police favoritism, corruption, and mob involvement. In 1924, the cab war started a new phase, as a violent union dispute started within the checker cab company. At first, checker cab was a non-union operation, and then as drivers started to unionize, the organization broke down into violence. Mobsters were trying to control the unions and joined in the fray. At one point, in an act of intimidation, 4 masked men assaulted a checker cab headquarters and put a group of non-union drivers against a wall, threatening to kill them. A police protective detail that was supposed to be protecting the building and those within it had been mysteriously pulled away moments before the attack. The next morning, the men made good on their threats as a drive-by shooting killed one of the non-union drivers. The fight between checker cab and yellow cab erupted again in 1928, when an argument over a Loop location turned into a general brawl and a checker driver named Eugene Thiveridge was shot dead. A yellow cab driver was arrested. Within a week, bombs exploded at 2 yellow cab car garages, destroying 17 cabs. Police theorized that the bombings were revenge for the shooting of Thiveridge. Then the war turned directly against John Hertz. He bred racehorses, and in October 1928, a fire burned down his stable, killing 11 racehorses worth an estimated $200,000. A prosecutor was assigned to investigate Checker, and a grand jury was impaneled over the incident. Then Hertz received death threats and was told that his grandchildren would be kidnapped. A few days later, another bomb was found at a yellow cab facility before it could detonate. Apparently getting the message, in 1929, Hertz sold his stock in yellow cab and left the business. Ironically, yellow cab's fleet merged with Checker. Eventually, the city council was able to tamp down the taxi wars by limiting the number of medallions, or permits, to legally operate a taxicab, and thus reducing competition. There were still some violent incidents over union contracts, but today the IRS considers taxicab drivers to be independent contractors, and that has put an end to most union disputes. Things like rates and pay are usually regulated by the cities, and the last major taxicab driver strike in Chicago was back in 1980. In many ways, the taxicab wars of the 1920s represented the stresses that were in Chicago and the nation generally at the time. Things like modernization, massive demographic changes, the economic dislocation of the recession that followed the First World War, and of course the coming Great Depression, the violence of the Prohibition era, rampant corruption among city officials and police departments, put the taxicab drivers, which is a natural point of job entry for new immigrants, on the front lines of social conflict. John Hertz did not stay retired for very long. In 1924, he had acquired a different business, which he had sold to General Motors. But in 1953, he purchased that business back from General Motors. It was, of course, a competitor for taxicabs, drive your own rental cars. And that company, Hertz Rent-A-Car, still bears his name and appropriately still uses the color yellow in all its marketing. Hi, I'm the History Guy. I have a degree in history and I love history. And if you love history too, this is the channel for you. This is a channel about history, and I tend to shy away from current events, if for no other reason than understanding of history can be skewed by current opinions. But one of the best reasons to study history is that historical lessons can inform us about current events. And sometimes the confluence between the two is just too much to ignore. And so this week, when news broke out about violence at a neo-Nazi rally in Virginia, it was hard not to see the similarity to questions that were raised in Illinois 40 years ago. And that incident, which people really don't understand very well, and if people have heard of it, it's probably because they saw the satirical representation in the 1980 film The Blues Brothers, rather than having any true historical understanding of events, is actually very important. That event that the press dubbed the Skokie Swastika War went to the very heart of understanding American constitutionally protected freedoms and what it means to live in a free society. And its history that deserves to be remembered. Located in the Chicago Lawn neighborhood and named after a French Jesuit missionary who was one of the first Europeans to explore and map the northern portion of the Mississippi River. At 323 acres, Marquette Park in Chicago is the largest park on the southwest side. In 1966, Marquette Park was the location of a march led by Martin Luther King Jr. as part of the Chicago Freedom Movement. During the march, a crowd of white residents gathered, some waving Confederate flags or throwing bottles, bricks, and rocks at the protesters. One of the rocks hit Dr. King in the head, above his right ear, but he was not seriously hurt and continued with the march. It was a seminal moment in the campaign, which uncovered deep racism in the city of Chicago and attracted national press. While not wholly successful in achieving their goals, the Chicago Freedom Movement was the most ambitious civil rights campaign in the north of the United States, and is largely credited with inspiring the 1968 Fair Housing Act. The symbolism of Marquette Park to the civil rights movement is not lost on the people of Chicago, and the park now houses a multimedia kiosk to celebrate the march through pictures, videos, and oral histories. But the symbolism of Marquette Park was also not lost on the people who threw stones. Frank Collin was born in Chicago in 1944. He attended Catholic elementary school and high school and briefly attended Southern Illinois University before dropping out. At some point, he became associated with the neo-Nazi movement, which his grandmother described as a mystery because Collin's own father was a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust. Originally, he joined the National Socialist White People's Party, but he had a falling out with them and left to create his own party, the National Socialist Party of America, or NSPA, in 1970. Collin located his organization in Chicago, partly because he thought the resistance to the Chicago Freedom Movement meant that he would have supporters there. However, Illinois Nazis found less success than Collin had hoped in a community with large numbers of immigrants from Europe whose relatives had suffered under Nazi occupation. Collin was at the center of many violent confrontations at protests and was arrested many times. Collin and the NSPA were well aware of the symbolism of the park where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assaulted. But when the city of Chicago refused to give them a permit to demonstrate in Marquette Park, Collin sued, arguing that that was a violation of his First Amendment rights. In 1972, the 7th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals upheld his complaint on First Amendment grounds, and the city of Chicago was forced to give the NSPA a permit to demonstrate in Marquette Park. The NSPA held intermittent rallies in Marquette Park from 1972 to 1976. But in 1976, the Chicago Parks Department changed the rules, and demanded a $250,000 bond to cover the cost of policing. Collin sued the city of Chicago again, but this time he also sent notes to all the Chicago suburbs asking for permits for the NSPA to protest the Chicago Parks Department's bond demands. This is where the Chicago suburb of Skokie comes into the picture. While every other municipality simply ignored Collin's request, Skokie responded by demanding an even higher bond and passing 3 ordinances: a liability insurance requirement, a ban on public demonstrations by members of any political party wearing military-style uniforms, and a prohibition of materials or symbols that promoted hatred of people by reason of their race, national origin, or religion. Skokie's response was different than the other Chicago suburbs for a very specific reason. Skokie had a significant Jewish population, the highest percentage of any of the Chicago suburbs, and much of that population had moved there after the Second World War. As one resident told the Chicago Tribune, Skokie was kind of a ground zero for Holocaust survivors in America. As many as 6,000 to 7,000 Holocaust survivors lived in Skokie. But Skokie's response and their Jewish history both played into Collin's need for attention, and so Skokie became the focus of a new lawsuit, one that garnered national attention. In a controversial move, Collin and the NSPA were represented by the American Civil Liberties Union. While the ACLU was generally seen as supporting liberal causes, it was an ardent advocate of freedom of speech, and had advocated on behalf of free speech rights for anarchists, Stalinists, and members of the Ku Klux Klan. As a testament to the sincerity of people's opinions, many members of the ACLU objected to the ACLU taking this case, and the organization lost hundreds of members. But the ACLU stuck to its principles. The case was argued all the way to the United States Supreme Court, which did not rule, as many think, on the actual free speech merits of the case, but rather instructed the state of Illinois to provide strict procedural safeguards if it moved to limit speech. In the decisions, the courts freely admitted that the speech and ideas of Collin and the NSPA were highly offensive. The attorneys for the village argued that the Nazi march, involving the display of uniforms and swastikas, would create a substantive evil that the village had a right to prohibit: the infliction of psychic trauma on resident Holocaust survivors and other Jewish residents. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit responded that they did not deny that the display would cause psychological trauma to the residents, but the court noted that the entire purpose of the First Amendment was to protect speech that might invite dispute. Quoting a previous Supreme Court decision, "It is firmly settled that under our Constitution, the public expression of ideas may not be prohibited merely because the ideas are themselves offensive to some of their hearers." The court was affirming a simple principle. Courts and governments are not allowed to ban speech because the ideas are unpopular, no matter how offensive that may be. That is, in fact, the entire point of the First Amendment. The court, noting their own disgust with the ideas espoused by the NSPA, also noted that their own disgust could not be considered. As Judge Wilbur Frank Pell attests, ideological tyranny, no matter how worthy its motivation, is forbidden as much to appointed judges as to elected officials. By 1978, the ACLU had won all the constitutional arguments, and the Nazis had won the right to a rally in Skokie. Rather anticlimactically, that rally never occurred. Collin had agreed to a compromise, and instead of marching in Skokie, the NSPA was allowed to march where it all began, in Marquette Park. They held a couple rallies there and a couple rallies in downtown Chicago, but in all cases, the couple hundred members of the NSPA were wildly outnumbered by thousands of counter-protesters. It seems the national attention had not helped Collin in the way that he thought it might. In 1979, in an apparent power struggle over control of the organization, Collin's own people turned him into police, having found evidence in his desk that he had illicit affairs with minors. He was convicted of child molestation and sentenced to 7 years in prison. He served the minimum 3 years and upon release left the Nazi Party and under the pseudonym Frank Joseph started writing neo-pagan books full of wild theories about the lost continent of Atlantis. The Skokie controversy raised interest in the United States in education about the Holocaust and sparked a surprising change in the village of Skokie. Whereas before, residents were reticent to talk about their experience in the Holocaust, after Colin, residents opened up in a storefront a Holocaust Museum and Education Center in 1984. In 1987, they dedicated a memorial to the Holocaust in downtown Skokie. In 1999, Skokie residents convinced the Illinois legislature to become the first state to require Holocaust education in its schools. And in 2009, the Holocaust Museum and Education Center left their storefront for a $45 million new Holocaust Museum and Education Center that now receives more than 300,000 visitors a year. J.B. Pritzker, who was in charge of raising those $45 million, credits the Skokie controversy with driving the interest in Holocaust education in the United States. He said it was a shot heard round the world for Holocaust education. And Richard Hershot, who's the executive director of the museum, noted that it was in the late 1970s that Skokie put the whole subject on the map. It didn't just spark an interest in Holocaust education, though. As Jeffrey R. Stone, who was an attorney for the ACLU who was involved in the case, noted in an editorial in 2011, it triggered one of those rare and remarkable moments in American history when citizens throughout the nation vigorously debated the meaning of the U.S. Constitution. And Ari Nair, who was the executive director of the ACLU at the time, noted that at every step of the way, the same lesson emerged. That in a nation where free speech generally prevails, it is best to take hate speech in stride. Hate groups and racial hate still exist in the United States, and there's still a distressing level of hate crime. The controversy certainly raised strong emotions on both sides and definitely distressed the people of Skokie. But it sparked conversations that moved the nation forward. As Mr. Nair notes, if you respond to speech by trying to prevent speech or responding with violence, all you do is give hate groups the attention that they crave. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.